Good morning. Welcome everyone to the Triangle Center for Spiritual Living. I think I'm going to have some microphone here pretty soon. Am I on? Ah, there we go. Now I can hear it. You're just loud. So I'm certainly glad that it's a beautiful day today, and it was really cold this morning, and it's warming up a little bit, and I'm very happy about that. Also happy to see so many new faces in the sanctuary this morning. Grateful for your being here. Grateful for all of you that have welcomed us into your homes today through the technology of streaming. Thank you very much for doing so. For those of you that don't know me or haven't met me yet, my name is Reverend Dusty Ripplemeyer. I am the senior minister of this lovely community. We are a Science of Mind community, part of a larger organization called Centers for Spiritual Living, which means that we teach and preach and follow the teachings of Ernest Holmes, who said and always said that it was important to remain open at the top. So it's a very dynamic religion, if you will, although he didn't even ever really want to call it a religion. He preferred to think of it as a philosophy and a way of life. So I'm so grateful for your being here.
The reading for today is by Elizabeth Lesser in her book, Broken Open: How Difficult Times Can Help Us Grow. The Egyptians called the bird the phoenix and believed that every 500 years he renewed his crest of his true self. Knowing that a new way could only be found with the death of worn-out habits, defenses, and beliefs, the phoenix built a pyre of cinnamon and myrrh, sat in the flames, and burned to death. Then he rose from the ashes as a new being, a fusion of who he had been before and who he had become. A new bird, yet ever more himself, changed, and at the same time the eternal phoenix. You and I are the phoenix. We too can reproduce ourselves from the shattered pieces of a difficult time. Our lives as us to die and to be reborn every time we confront change within ourselves, and change in our world. When we descend all the way down to the bottom of a loss and dwell patiently with an open heart in the darkness and the pain, we can bring back up with us the sweetness of life and the exhilaration of inner growth. When there's nothing left to lose, we find the true self, the self that is whole, the self that is enough, and the self that no longer looks to others for definition or completion or anything but companionship along the journey. This is the way to live a meaningful and hopeful life, a life of real happiness and inner peace. And so
Beautiful.
It is.
Thank you so very much. So good morning and welcome to those of you who may have just arrived in the sanctuary. The theme for the month of February is diversity and inclusivity, finding peace and joy in today's world. And my talk title is Rise Above Your Story. Now, I do not think that I would be wrong if I were to say that every one of us here has a story. That each of us created a story about ourselves or our world at some point in time in our lives. A story that we created out of the experiences of our lives, one that has defined us and has actually created the life that we're living right now. It's been a story that we've told ourselves over and over again, a story that may have served us at some point in time, but maybe is no longer serving us. A story that we might be a little bit reluctant to let go of. Now, in a month on Diversity and inclusivity, diversity shows up that each of us has a different story. That each one is unique in the circumstances that unfolded and what we told ourselves about the circumstances. And inclusivity shows up that we all have a story, that we all have some wounds, or we have all experienced some challenges in our lives. Human beings are by nature story-making machines. Things happen, and we typically have a lot of questions about what happened or why it happened. And often at the level of the experience, there aren't any answers to our questions. And yet we have a need to have some answers to fill those gaps. So in the absence of answers, we make up some stories. And just as often as we make up the stories that we make up are often not accurate, nor are they the truth. We begin by telling these stories to ourselves over and over and over again in our heads, and then telling others over and over and over again until we actually believe that the story is the truth of the experience that we had. I had a story. When I say it like that, it kind of sounds a little bit like maybe I only had one story. We all know that's not the truth. But I had a story. I had a story that I carried with me for a very long time. It was a story that was created by a 5-year-old out of the experiences of her life. Now, I have 2 brothers and a sister. But when we were going through these experiences, it was only my 2 brothers and myself. And while we were not bad, we could be rambunctious. And while we were not terrible, we could be a handful for a young stay-at-home mom. Now, my dad worked long hours, and he often came home very tired, and he could see that my mother was also very tired. Now, if he happened to come home and we were still being a little bit wild, running around the house, he would quite often say to us, just stop doing what you're doing or you're going to drive your mother crazy. Not too dramatic or traumatic in and of itself, but my mother actually did have a nervous breakdown, and she had to go away for a little while. Seemed like forever to a little 5-year-old girl. And in that moment, I created a story. I told myself that it was my fault and that I had to be perfect so that the people in my life that I loved would not go away. Now, that story, while certainly not the truth, was etched into my consciousness and actually became the context of my life. That story defined me as a people pleaser. That story defined me as someone who believed she needed to pay more attention to other people's needs and wants than I could or should pay to my own needs and wants, so much so that I couldn't even tell you what I actually needed or wanted in any given moment. On one hand, that story served me because I always strived to be the very best that I could possibly be. But on the other hand, it affected my relationships with others in not always such good ways. You cannot imagine some of the interesting choices I made from that context. Now, most of us have at least one area in our lives in which we feel trapped either by a circumstance that we're going through now or a circumstance that we went through in the future or in the past, or by a story that we created and the habitual patterns and behaviors that began when we created that story. Now, the story, the circumstances, and what we've told ourselves about them are or have been dragging us down. Simple as that. We don't think that they will change on their own, and we feel helpless to change them by ourselves. Now, this can happen on an individual level, or it can happen collectively as a family, as a culture, as a nation, or as the whole of humanity. The good news is that we have an opportunity. We have the ability to rise above our stories and find peace and joy in today's world. Now, in order to do that, I believe that we have to understand what these stories are truly capable of. If our stories fill us with peace and joy and love, then we are creating them from the deepest aspect of ourselves. We are creating them from the truth of who we are as divine emanations of God. And when our stories fill us with anger, resentment, frustration, worry, doubt, or fear, then we are not creating them from our divinity, but rather we are creating them from our perceptions, or from our beliefs, or from our judgments, or from the expectations of how we believe that our life should unfold, or how we believe that everybody else should be behaving. These stories and the emotions that we feel about them can land us in a state of victimhood. I am not saying, and I want you to hear that I am not saying that there are not experiences in our lives in which the most appropriate response is anger, grief, fear, despair, or loss. Many people in this room have experienced some unimaginable things. I have spoken with some people who have experienced some unimaginable things. We have all listened to the news or read on our computer screen about the atrocities that people have done to each other in the past or right now, today. I'm not saying that we should not feel anger, grief, loss, despair, or fear. Anger and fear can be very powerful emotions. When used appropriately, they can prompt us to take action and to become very constructive. They can propel us forward, to give us the energy that we need to move through and beyond our experiences. Grief and loss must be felt fully in order for us to move beyond them. But the problem becomes, or arises, when we keep these emotions around and we keep telling the story over and over again. Pamela Amundsen, in her book Clarity Quest, says when we do that, these powerful emotions, and I add stories, can become toxic. When we continue to harbor anger, fear, and resentment, they turn destructive. She tells the story of a friend of hers who was laid off from a major bank. He and some of his peers were invited to a meeting, and they were told that they were being terminated and that there were guards that were there that would be able to escort them to their offices where they could pick up their belongings on their way out. Now, it happened out of the blue, and her friend was very angry and it carried a lot of resentment towards management. All of the managers became the bad guys, and he became their victim. Now, the story that he told and continued to tell throughout the next year fueled his anger. He went to a number of different interviews, but no one would hire him. He later learned that his negativity, fueled by his anger, his resentment and his victimhood put people off. One interviewer even told him that he appeared to have a chip on his shoulder and that they had far too many really qualified candidates for them to hire someone that was so negative. Our stories and the emotions that we have around them can interfere with our ability to move forward in our lives, to function in a healthy way, or to create new experiences that we might actually enjoy. Pamela Amundsen says, if you don't take time to acknowledge and release these emotions, they eventually filter into every aspect of your life. It is far better to deal with them, to acknowledge them, to feel them, to take action, and then to release them. When we do not release these toxic emotions and our old stories, we are stuck in victimhood, bound to the past and unable to move forward. Now, when we live our lives from this state of victimhood, we're not called a victim as in the typical way of being victimized by a mental or an emotional tragedy, but rather by being affected by your point of view. In victimhood, we believe that all of life's circumstances are the function of the external world. We live from the outside in, always being blown about and battered around by the conditions of our lives. We live from reaction to reaction, expending our mental and emotional resources in order to cope with what life is always doing to us. We might make statements such as, "They did this to me," or "If the economy were only better," or "If I had a different boss, I'm sure I would be more productive." We feel like we have no control and may find ourselves asking, "Why me?" as though the quality of our lives depended on some external deity, some external person, or some external situation, when the truth of it is that moving out of victim consciousness means that we take responsibility for our lives. Taking responsibility implies that we have the ability to choose, and we do. We were given free will when we arrived on the planet. We can choose, and we can choose again and again and again. Tom Krause, author and motivational speaker, says, "Getting over a painful experience is much like crossing monkey bars." Remember those? You know, you hang like this. You have to let go at some point in order to move forward. Now, letting go is never easy. Getting out of our comfort zone, leaving our familiar situations, and breaking old thinking patterns and habits is uncomfortable and sometimes feels a little stressful. It could be a lot of work. Fear of the unknown is one of the biggest blocks that keep people from letting go of anything. So, what do most people do? Nothing. They just stay where they are. Just stay where they are. They prefer the safety of what they know, even if they're miserable. They hang on to their stories, and then they make excuse after excuse about why they're unable to let them go. For myself, I let go of my story when I got sick and tired of telling it. When I got sick and tired of hearing myself tell it. When I recognized that everybody else in my life was sick and tired of hearing me tell it. I was able to let go of my story when I realized that I was unhappy living a life that looked perfect from the outside, but in which I was miserable. when I recognized that I was living a life based on a story that a 5-year-old created about what I needed to be or to do, and that it was no longer serving me. I was able to let go of my story when I became willing to work on shining the light on the old habitual thought patterns that I had that were running my life, and became willing to do the work to rise above them. Often we might not even be aware of how deeply entrenched these thought patterns are and the stories that we've created until we take time out to really figure out what is blocking us from moving forward. Whenever we are feeling stressed or intimidated or like a failure, it is because we have allowed our emotions and our stories to control our minds and then to control our actions. We can decide today to let go of how we think our lives should have unfolded, of how we think other people should think or behave, of what we think other people should do. We can decide today that no matter the situation, that we are no longer going to give our power away to anyone, including to our own emotions. We can decide to let go of the tendency to blame others for our problems. We can decide to let go of our anger and resentment, our guilt or remorse, or the need that we might have to be a victim. We can decide today to rise above our stories and to find peace and joy in today's world. In her book, Rising Strong, Brené Brown describes her Rising Strong process. It is a process designed to regain our footing in the midst of a struggle, to regain our footing in the midst of our stories. It's a process of owning our stories. And she says we own our stories so that we don't spend our lives being defined by them or denying them. For me, it's a process of rising above them. This Rising Strong process is comprised of 3 R's. And the 3 R's are the reckoning, the rumble, and the revolution. Sounds fun, huh? Now, this is a huge conversation, one that we really can't do justice to completely today, but what I believe is that we can all catch a glimpse of what is possible if we are willing to work through this process or something like it. So the reckoning includes the ability to recognize and to be curious about our feelings and how they connect with the way we think and behave. People who are able to rise strong are able to reckon with their feelings, meaning that they recognize when they are feeling something. They recognize when a button is being pushed. They recognize when they are being hooked or when they are being triggered by something or someone. They then become curious about what is happening. And now underneath that awareness is the truth that our feelings, our thoughts, and our behaviors are all intimately connected to each other. What research has shown is that when we feel a feeling, there is a voice overlay, a thought that immediately precedes the feeling. Precedes the feeling. So, for example, we find ourselves in a situation that we immediately have a thought about. That thought drives the feelings, and the feelings drive the behavior. So can you see why it would be important to get all the way back to the thought? Now, people who are able to rise strong become curious about their feelings and the thoughts that are behind them. The rumble. The rumble is when we really look at our stories. People that are able to rise strong are willing to rumble with their stories. Brené Brown says, by rumble, I mean that they get honest about the stories they've made up about their struggle, and they are willing to revisit, challenge, and reality check their narratives as they dig into such topics as boundaries, shame, blame, resentment, heartbreak, generosity, and forgiveness. So rumbling with these topics allows us to move beyond our first response, beyond our usual go-to reaction, to come to a greater understanding of what is actually happening. People who are able to rise strong are not afraid to do the inner work that is necessary to do to be able to get at the underlying truth behind the story. In the revolution, we are able to write a new ending to our story. Rumbling with our stories and owning the underlying truth beneath them allows us, should we be willing, to write a new, courageous ending to our story, one that actually transforms who we are and how we engage in the world, one that actually allows us to be the phoenix rising out of the fire of the struggle. Rather than being tied to old thoughts, beliefs and behaviors and patterns, we are available to the allness of possibility. And we can create that. We can choose to create that new ending to our story. So the invitation today is to become more aware of your feelings as you are feeling them, to be willing to become curious about your feelings. The invitation today is to be willing to put a pause on your typical go-to response and behaviors and take the time to do the inner work to see what thought or what belief is behind the feeling. Being willing to rumble with your story in order to get to the underlying truth. The invitation today is to be willing to write a new, courageous ending to your story, one that will allow you to rise above it. And as you're rising above it, take time to notice how you are literally inviting more peace and more joy into your lives. And so it is. So I invite you to turn within. And as I do so, I am acutely aware of the power and presence of God that is within me and surrounding me. I know that it is the presence of peace and joy. I know that it is the truth of who I am. And just as I know that this is my truth, I know that it is true for each and every person here this morning, that each of us is a unique and divine expression of the divine. And it is from that place of unity that place of wholeness, that place of oneness, connected to each other, to God, and to life itself by this golden thread of God stuff, that I speak these words about and for each of us today. Truly knowing that we are spiritual beings having a human incarnation, and that as we move through the circumstances and the situations of our lives, we have free will. We have the ability to become really, really aware of our feelings, and to become curious about them. And to know that as we become aware and we become curious, that we have an opportunity to see beyond them, to look at the underlying beliefs and thoughts that created the feeling in the first place. And when we do that, we have an opportunity to change our minds about those thoughts, that we can create anew, that like the phoenix, we can let go of anything that is no longer serving us, our stories, our emotions, anything that no longer allows us to live the life that we want to live. We can let it go. We can move on. We can write a new, courageous story. And what I claim for each of us this morning by the power of my voice is that there is ease and grace around doing this. That we recognize that we worship in a community that is here for each other, that we support each other on this journey, that we remind each other of who we are in those moments when we forget. That we assist each other in creating new stories, in rising above the old, and allowing more peace and joy to reveal itself, knowing that it's always there, simply hidden behind the dirt and grime of the journey. And I'm so grateful to know this truth, so grateful to speak these words. So grateful for the power of prayer, knowing that these words are loosed into a law that only ever says yes, that they are clothed in form even as I am speaking them. And so I speak them and I release them with love and gratitude and full expectation of their manifestation, letting go and letting God be God. And I invite each of us to anchor it for ourselves and for each other simply by saying, "And so it is. Amen, amen, amen."